The incense was measured at 14 grams. I know this because I weighed it myself, twice, on the brass scale provided by the confessor's adjutant, and recorded the figure in the margin of the ceremonial log before the first chant began. 14 grams of Terran amber leaf, pressed and dried according to the Ministorum formula codified in the 37th Millennium, ground to a consistency finer than powderedite, and loaded into the censer by my own hands. The weight mattered. Everything aboard this vessel was measured, and everything that was measured was correct. I held the censer's chain at the prescribed angle, 30 degrees from vertical, and walked the perimeter of the 9th reliquary door, while the vox speakers embedded in the corridor walls emitted the chant of secured passage in low Gothic. The words were not sung. They were spoken in flat, recursive cadence by a servitor whose jaw had been replaced with a vocalizer unit, tuned to a frequency that sat just below comfortable hearing. The sound pressed against the inner ear like a thumb against a bruise. 6 servo skulls orbited the doorframe in a pattern I had verified against the rite of enclosure, Chapter 14, Subsection 9. Their ocular lenses blinked red in sequence. Their anti-grav units emitted a hum so constant it became indistinguishable from silence after the first 2 minutes. I was an archivist attendant of the Reliquary Vaults, 3rd year of the Indomitus Crusade, assigned to the Emperor's own Void flagship by a chain of administrative transfers I had never fully understood. My designation was Scribe Witness Tertius, Vault Sector Aurum 9. My duties were specific. I catalogued devotional offerings transferred from conquered shrine worlds, verified the purity seals affixed by the ship's confessors, and maintained the physical ledgers that recorded which relics occupied which vault. I did not interpret. I did not advise. I recorded, and what I recorded became true. The 9th reliquary door was a slab of ceramite plating faced with hammered gold and inlaid with scripture in a language older than High Gothic. The letters had been acid-etched by artisans who had died before the vessel's last refit. Their names were not recorded. Above the door, an imperial aquila spread its wings across 4 meters of polished obsite, its twin heads staring down the corridor in opposite directions as though guarding against approach from either side. The door's locking mechanism required 3 keys turned simultaneously, one held by the confessor, one by the senior archivist, and one by a representative of the Mechanicus, whose title I never learned, and whose face I never saw beneath the cowl of cabling and optical feeds that covered his skull. The relic to be sealed within was said to contain a fragment of the Emperor's own armor plating, recovered from Terra centuries prior, authenticated by the Ordo Hereticus, transferred through 11 intermediary vaults across 9 subsectors before arriving in the cargo holds of this vessel during a resupply action above Gathalamor. I had processed the transfer documentation myself, 17 pages of verification stamps, countersigned by authorities whose seals I recognized only from the registry of sanctioned approvals. The parchment smelled of old wax and something sharper, metallic, like the air after a lumen globe bursts. The 3 keys turned. The locks disengaged with a sound like bones settling. The door opened inward on hinges that had been oiled with consecrated machine fluid, and the interior of the 9th reliquary was revealed to the witnessing party. I saw it. I do not mean I glimpsed it, or that I caught an impression of it before the incense smoke obscured my vision. The censer was at my side. The air was clear. The lumen strips inside the vault activated on a timed delay, flooding the space with cold white light from ceiling fixtures set at regulation intervals. I saw the interior of the 9th reliquary with the same clarity I saw the corridor, the door, the servo skulls, the confessor's hands. It was empty. Not ransacked, not damaged, not in a state of preparation or transition. Empty, in the way a room is empty when it was never intended to hold anything. The walls were bare ceramite, unpainted, unsealed, showing the faint grid marks of manufacturing templates that had never been covered with devotional facing. The floor was deck plating, standard naval issue, the same flooring found in cargo bays and munitions corridors. There were no shrine alcoves, no relic stands, no prayer rails or incense mounts or candle niches. The chamber extended further than I expected, perhaps 30 meters deep and 20 wide, and the far wall was featureless except for a single ventilation grill cycling air that tasted of recycled humidity and dust. The relic crate, still sealed, sat on the deck plating just inside the threshold. It had been placed there by servitors before the ceremony began. No plinth waited for it, no altar had been prepared. The confessor stepped forward without pause. His robes swept the deck plating. He produced a purity seal from the pouch at his belt, pressed it to the interior frame of the door, and spoke the litany of enclosure in a voice that did not waver. The Mechanicus representative extended a mechadendrite and applied a data wafer to the lock housing. The senior archivist, a woman named Decuri, whose face was mapped with age lines deeper than the scripture on the door, made a notation on her data slate and nodded once. The door closed. The locks re-engaged. The servo skulls completed their final orbit and powered down to standby mode, settling into wall-mounted docking cradles with small clicks. I stood in the corridor holding the sensor, and the chant continued for another 40 seconds before the servitor's vocalizer clicked off mid-syllable. Its programmed duration expired. The silence that followed was not dramatic, it was administrative. The ceremony was complete. The schedule had been observed. Confessor Aldrin turned to me and held out his hand. I gave him the ceremonial log. He reviewed my notations, including the incense weight, the chant duration, the seal placement coordinates, and signed at the bottom of the page with a stylus that left ink the color of dried blood. He returned the log without comment. I opened my mouth. I am not certain what I intended to say. Perhaps I meant to ask about the vault's condition. Perhaps I meant to note the absence of shrine furniture for the official record. Perhaps I simply needed to hear my own voice confirm that I had seen what I had seen. Decuri looked at me. Her expression was not hostile. It was not warning. It was the expression of someone who has already accounted for your reaction and found it irrelevant. I closed my mouth. The log was filed. My witness signature was entered into the shift record. My presence at the sealing of the 9th reliquary was officially documented, time-stamped, and archived in the central Vox memory core of Vault Sector Aurum 9. I returned to my station and resumed stamping purity seals for the next scheduled transfer. The brass stamp was warm from the heating element built into its base. The ink smelled of iron and tallow. I pressed it against parchment 47 times before the shift bell rang, and each impression was identical to the last. That night, in the narrow berth assigned to archival staff, I lay on my cot and listened to the ship. The flagship's internal acoustics were layered and constant. Cathedral bells chimed the watch changes through Vox speakers set into every corridor junction, their tone calibrated to carry through bulkheads without distortion. Behind the bells, a subsonic vibration ran through the hull plating, the pulse of plasma reactors buried deep in the vessel's core, miles below the habitation decks. Occasionally, the distant groan of void shields cycling through test patterns would ripple through the superstructure, a sound like a giant clearing its throat. I had been aboard for 11 months. I had learned to sleep inside these sounds the way one learns to sleep inside a storm, by accepting that silence was not available and stillness was not offered. The ship moved. The ship breathed. The ship was alive in the way that only things older than memory can be alive, not with warmth, but with momentum. I told myself the 9th reliquary had been empty because its consecration was incomplete. The shrine furniture would be installed during a later phase. The chamber's bareness was temporary, a stage of preparation I did not have clearance to understand. The relic crate had been placed inside for safekeeping during the interim. This explanation was reasonable. I wrote it in my private journal using a handheld stylus and a scrap of parchment I had saved from a misfiled requisition order. I wrote it clearly, and without hesitation, and then I folded the parchment and placed it beneath my pillow and closed my eyes. Sleep came slowly. The incense smell lingered on my hands, and beneath it I could still detect the cold metallic scent of empty air. The following day was 5th day on the liturgical calendar, which meant morning devotions were extended by 9 minutes to accommodate the recitation of the Emperor's ninefold blessing. I stood in the archival chapel with 11 other scribes and attendants, facing an altarpiece depicting the Emperor bestowing light upon a kneeling world. The painting was enormous, 12 meters tall, rendered in pigments mixed with sanctified oils that gave the Emperor's face a luminous, almost wet quality, as though the paint had never fully dried. The confessor assigned to our section was not Aldrin, but a younger man named Torvus, whose voice had the particular flatness of someone trained in the Schola Progenium and never fully recovered. He led the recitation without inflection. We responded in unison. The words were so familiar they no longer required thought. They passed through my mouth the way air passed through the ventilation grills, part of the ship's circulation, functional and invisible. I watched the Emperor's painted face and told myself again that proximity to this vessel ensured purity. The Catechism said so. Lecture 11 of the Primer of Sacred Transit stated that the Emperor's flagship was shielded not only by Geller fields and void barriers, but by the accumulated faith of every soul who had served aboard its decks since its commissioning. The machine spirits that governed its systems were said to be so ancient and so deeply consecrated that no corruption could persist in their presence. The chaplains assigned to the flagship had reportedly never sanctioned a single crew member for doctrinal impurity, because impurity could not survive within the ship's spiritual architecture. I believed this. I had no reason not to. The evidence surrounded me daily. The corridors were clean. The devotional murals were maintained by dedicated artisan serfs who repainted faded sections with painstaking care. The meals served in the refectory were bland but sufficient, eaten beneath a ceiling mosaic showing the Emperor's triumph at Ullanor, and every table faced a small shrine niche containing a candle that was never permitted to go out. The ship's population numbered in the tens of thousands, layered across habitation tiers that descended from the command spires to the deep hull labor decks, and every tier had its own chapel, its own confessor, its own schedule of devotions calibrated to the shift cycle. Nothing was neglected. Nothing was permitted to decay. If a lumen globe failed, a maintenance servitor replaced it within the hour. If a hymnal page tore, a fresh copy was printed and distributed before the next devotional period. The system was so thorough, so self-correcting, that imperfection felt impossible. After devotions, I returned to my archival station and opened the day's assignment queue. 43 entries requiring stamp verification, 12 relic transfer forms awaiting countersignature, 1 amendment order from the senior archivist's office, requesting that the ceremonial log for the 9th reliquary sealing be copied in triplicate and forwarded to the Administratum Liaison Office on Deck Primus. I completed the copies by hand, as required. The quill was a reed stem fitted with a metal nib, standard issue for archival scribes, and the ink was black with a faint violet undertone that indicated it had been mixed with trace amounts of blessed anointing oil. Each copy took 40 minutes. The text was formulaic: date, location, participants, ritual sequence, seal placement, witness attestation. Nowhere in the log was the interior of the 9th reliquary described. The entry read, in full, Reliquary 9, Vault Sector Aurum. Contents received and sealed per right of enclosure, Chapter 14. Spiritual status, complete, spiritually complete. I copied the words 3 times. My hand did not hesitate. The ink dried in clean, even strokes. But something had changed in the way I moved through the ship. I noticed it first in the corridors. The flagship's arterial passages were immense, wide enough for 6 servitors to walk abreast. their ceilings vaulted and lined with stained glass panels that filtered lumen light into colored patterns on the deck plating. I had walked these corridors for 11 months and seen them as confirmation. Every arch, every carved buttress, every devotional frieze was proof that this vessel existed to glorify the Emperor. Now I noticed the intervals, the distance between shrines, the stretches of bare wall where devotional panels should have continued but did not. I told myself it was the natural consequence of a ship this size. No vessel could be ornamented in its entirety. There would always be structural sections, junctions, access corridors that served function rather than faith. This was not absence, it was architecture. I consulted the ship's official schematic, available to archival staff through a wall-mounted data lectern near the refectory. The schematic was enormous, a three-dimensional hololithic projection of the flagship's internal layout rendered in pale green wireframe. I located Vault Sector Aurum 9 and examined the surrounding decks. The 9th reliquary was marked with the standard symbol for a consecrated vault, a small aquila enclosed in a circle. Its status notation read, active, contents, sacred, access, restricted. No mention of emptiness, no mention of pending installation. The schematic treated the vault as full, functional, and holy. I replaced the data lectern's access card in its slot and walked to the refectory. I ate a ration of grain paste and reconstituted protein under the Olana mosaic and drank water from a tin cup stamped with the ship's registry number. The food tasted of nothing in particular. It sustained, that was its purpose. I returned to my station and opened my private journal. I found the parchment scrap from the night before, the one on which I had written my reasonable explanation for the vault's emptiness. I read it once. Then I turned the parchment over, dipped my quill, and wrote a single correction. I crossed out temporary preparation and wrote consecrated void. The terminology was borrowed from a subsection of the rite of enclosure I had transcribed months earlier, referring to spaces held in reserve for future divine purpose. It was a real designation. It existed in doctrine. It fit. I told myself the vault was a consecrated void awaiting the Emperor's directive to fill it. The emptiness was intentional, sacred, beyond my understanding. The correction was small. The falsification was smaller. I was adjusting my own private notes to align with what the official record already stated. No one would ever read this scrap of parchment. No one would ever compare it to the ceremonial log. But I knew what I had done. I had chosen the record over my own eyes. I had decided, consciously and without external pressure, that the system was correct and my perception was not. This felt like loyalty. 2 weeks after the sealing, I received a reassignment order stamped with the seal of the Engineer Adjutant's office. I was to assist in cataloging unused chapel modules stored in the lower cargo arteries of Deck Septimus. The order was routine, one of dozens of cross-departmental assistance requests that circulated through the archival staff pool each month, and I accepted it without concern. The lower cargo arteries were accessed through a freight elevator that descended 17 levels below the habitation tier. The elevator was a bare metal cage, large enough to transport munitions pallets, and it moved with a grinding deliberation that suggested its mechanisms had not been serviced recently. The air changed as we descended. The familiar scent of incense and candle wax, present on every habitation deck like a permanent weather system, thinned and disappeared. In its place came the smell of machine oil, ozone, and something drier, the scent of spaces that had not been breathed in regularly. The tech priest engineer waiting for me at the bottom was designated Row Vellum 44. I knew this because the designation was stamped on a plate riveted to the front of his chest housing, just below the junction where his original ribcage had been replaced with a lattice of metallic conduits. His face was half hidden by an optical array that covered his left eye and most of his forehead. the lens cluster rotating with small clicks as he focused on different distances. His remaining biological eye was pale and dry, blinking at intervals that seemed timed rather than reflexive. He spoke in a voice filtered through a vox grill implanted in his throat. The words were precise and without emphasis. "Scribe witness Tertius, you will record the inventory designations I provide. Standard Mechanicus format. No editorial notation." I followed him into the cargo arteries. The scale was the first thing. I had understood, intellectually, that the Emperor's flagship was vast. The habitation decks alone could house a city, but the cargo arteries existed on a different order of magnitude. Tunnels wide enough to drive armored transports through. Their ceilings lost in shadow above the reach of the lumen strips bolted to the walls. The floor was industrial grating over maintenance crawlways, and every footstep rang with a hollow resonance that suggested deep structural spaces beneath. The chapel modules were stacked along one wall for a distance I could not estimate. They were components of devotional architecture, arched door frames carved from synthetic stone and faced with gold leaf, altar platforms with pre-drilled mounting points for icon stands, wall panels embossed with scenes from the Imperial Creed, ceiling coffers designed to hold suspended censers, prayer rail segments in bundles of 10, font basins wrapped in oilcloth, and statue plinths, dozens of them, rectangular blocks of polished granite with recessed sockets for securing the feet of devotional figures. The statues themselves were crated nearby. I could see their forms through gaps in the packing material: saints with upraised hands, angels with spread wings, imperial heroes in armor, and at least 3 representations of the Emperor himself, each 4 meters tall, their faces serene and terrible in the partial light, all of it unused. All of it catalogued, numbered, and stored. Row Vellum 4-4 moved along the stacks with mechanical efficiency, reading designation codes from data tags wired to each component and dictating them to me in flat, unbroken sequence. I wrote them down on the inventory sheet clipped to my databoard, 1 line per item, and tried to keep pace. After 90 minutes, I asked a question. It was not a complex question. I asked where these modules were intended to be installed. The Engenseer paused. His optical array rotated twice. "Their installation has not been authorized," he said. I waited for elaboration. None came. I asked when installation might be authorized. "When operational requirements permit devotional expansion." He resumed dictating codes. I wrote down the next 40 entries in silence. The cargo artery stretched ahead of us, curving gently to follow the hull's curvature, and the stacks of chapel components continued without interruption. I began to estimate the quantity. Hundreds of individual pieces. Enough, I calculated roughly, to furnish at least a dozen full chapels, perhaps more. All of it sitting in a cargo tunnel that smelled of lubricant and dust. At the end of the inventory session, Row Vellum 4-4 handed me the summary tag to sign. The designation for the entire stock was printed at the top of the form: redundant devotional structure hold classification, indefinite, redundant, not pending, not reserved, redundant. I signed. The engineer filed his copy and departed without farewell, his mechanical limbs carrying him back toward the elevator with a gait that was smoother than any human walk. I stood alone in the cargo artery for a moment, surrounded by enough devotional architecture to sanctify an entire deck, and listened to the sound of the ship's hull. Down here, without the overlay of hymns and bells and vox chant, the flagship's true voice was audible. The deep, structural groan of metal under void pressure, the distant thrum of reactor cycles, the hiss of atmospheric processes working to keep breathable air circulating through spaces that were never designed for human presence. The sound was not sacred. It was industrial. I returned to the habitation deck and filed the inventory report. The shift bell rang. I went to evening devotions. I spoke the catechism. The words came easily. They always did. The pilgrims arrived during the third week after the sealing, transferred from a convoy of rescue transports that had collected survivors from a world called Vostris Minoris, recently purged of Xenos infestation. I learned the name from the intake forms that arrived at my station in a sealed courier pouch, hand-delivered by a Ministorum functionary who smelled of sweat and recycled air and spoke to me only to confirm my authorization stamp. The intake forms listed 1,247 individuals, men, women, children, former civilians, hab workers, agri-serfs, a handful of minor administratum clerks, all certified faithful by the Missionaria Galaxia detachment that had overseen the purge. All cleared for pilgrim passage aboard sanctioned Imperial vessels. They believed they had been saved. I know this because I processed them. Not all 1,247. My section handled 340 intake entries over a 14-hour shift, and I personally verified and stamped 112 of them. The pilgrims filed through the intake hall on Deck Tertius, a vaulted chamber with marble flooring and a ceiling painted with clouds and golden light, designed to evoke the sensation of emerging into paradise. They walked between rows of incense braziers tended by servo cherubs, small flying automata shaped like winged infants, and they knelt at the threshold of the processing station, where a confessor in full vestments spoke the blessing of arrival over each group of 20. Many were weeping, some pressed their foreheads to the floor. A woman in the third group clutched a child against her chest and spoke in a dialect I did not understand, but the word she repeated most often was clearly a variant of Emperor. She said it with the desperate, cracked open reverence of someone who has been praying in a burning building and suddenly feels rain. I stamped their forms. Name, origin, world. Assigned designation. Spiritual clearance code. Each form required 3 stamps, one for identity verification, one for medical clearance, one for devotional assessment. The devotional assessment stamp was mine. I applied it based on the confessor's verbal confirmation, delivered in a steady cadence of cleared, 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 as each pilgrim passed his station. By the 6th hour, the first reassignment orders began arriving. They came on standard administratum paper, beige with the watermark of the Departamento Munitorum, printed in batch format, 20 to 40 names per sheet, followed by a reassignment code. The codes were alphanumeric strings I did not immediately recognize. I consulted the reference guide clipped to my station's filing rack. Most of the codes corresponded to labor deck assignments, waste processing, cargo handling, atmospheric filtration maintenance, hull breach patching teams. Labor decks, not pilgrim quarters, not devotional sanctums, not the residential tiers where faithful servants of the Emperor lived and prayed. By the 9th hour, over 800 of the 1,247 pilgrims had been reassigned. Their names were being struck from the pilgrim roster and entered into the labor allocation registry. The forms I had stamped with devotional clearance were collected by a courier and replaced with amended versions listing new designations. Where Pilgrim had been printed, the amended forms read Auxiliary Crew, Class Septimus. At the 11th hour, a directive arrived from the senior archivist's office. It was addressed to all intake processing scribes and worded with the particular clarity that indicated it had been reviewed by legal authority before distribution. The directive stated that all reassigned individuals were to be recorded under the category relocated for spiritual integration. This phrase was to replace any prior designation in the Pilgrim intake log. No further notation was required. I held the directive in my hands and read it twice. The phrasing was precise: relocation, spiritual, integration. Each word was defensible. Each word, examined individually, meant something plausible. Together, they meant nothing. I looked at my station. The 112 forms I had stamped were arranged in neat rows, awaiting final filing. I could see the names: Jeren Voss, Mila Toren, Klaus de Bray. The woman with the child had been listed as Erevan Suze, dependent, 1. Her devotional assessment stamp was still wet. The courier was standing at my station, waiting for the amended forms. I picked up the amendment sheet. I began copying the new designation onto each form, writing "relocated for spiritual integration" in the space where I had written "Pilgrim." My handwriting was even. The ink flowed smoothly. I finished all 112 amendments in 40 minutes and handed the stack to the courier, who placed them in a sealed pouch and departed. The intake hall was empty by the time my shift ended. The incense braziers had been extinguished. The servo cherubs hung motionless in their docking cradles along the ceiling. The marble floor showed faint scuff marks where hundreds of knees had pressed against it in gratitude. I walked back to my berth in silence. I did not go to evening devotions. I told myself I was tired, and I was, but the truth was simpler. I did not want to hear the confessor speak words I had just learned could be rearranged to mean anything. The discovery of the chapel happened 5 days later, and it happened because I made an error. A purity seal I had stamped for a relic transfer in Vault Sector Aurum 7 had been misfiled. The transfer form indicated the seal had been applied to a reliquary in Subcorridor 14, Gamma, but the physical seal had been logged at 14, Delta. The discrepancy was minor, a single character in a location code, but archival protocol required physical verification. I was dispatched to Subcorridor 14, Delta to confirm whether the seal was present and correctly placed. Subcorridor 14, Delta ran along the inner hull curve of the upper devotional tier, a region of the ship I rarely accessed. The corridor was narrower than the arterial passages, lit by lumen strips that cast a yellowish, aging light, and the walls were paneled with devotional bas-reliefs depicting scenes from the Lectitio Divinitatis. The air was still. No bells reached this section. No vox chant played. I found the misfiled seal without difficulty. It was affixed to the correct reliquary, which had been assigned to 14 Gamma but physically located in 14 Delta due to a corridor renumbering that had not been updated in the master schematic. The discrepancy was structural, not spiritual. I noted the correction on my data board and turned to leave. The chapel was behind a door I had not noticed on my approach. It was unmarked, lacking the standard devotional placard that identified every consecrated space aboard the ship. The door was ajar by perhaps 2 centimeters, enough to allow a thin line of light to fall across the corridor floor. I should have continued past. My assignment was complete. The correction had been made. I pushed the door open. The chapel was small, perhaps 10 meters by 6. Its walls were bare metal, unpainted, with none of the facing or ornamentation that characterized every other devotional space I had seen aboard the flagship. No icons. No statuary, no candle niches, no prayer rails, no devotional murals, no ceiling frescoes, no hanging censers. The floor was deck plating, unpolished, identical to the industrial sections deep in the ship's belly. At the far end, a single altar stood against the wall. It was a plain slab of metal, waist-high, bolted to the deck. On its surface, the imperial aquila had been etched with a cutting tool, the lines rough and unadorned. No gold, no silver, no precious materials of any kind. A man stood before the altar. He wore the robes of a confessor, the deep crimson of the ministorum, but the robes were worn and faded, the hem frayed. His hands were clasped before him, and he was speaking. The Catechism of Vigilance. I recognized the cadence even before I identified the specific words. In the Emperor's sight we stand. In the Emperor's shadow we serve. In the Emperor's silence we endure. His voice trembled on. Silence. He repeated the line. In the Emperor's silence we endure. The tremble was still there, a faint vibration in the consonants, as though the word silence had a weight his throat could not fully support. I stood in the doorway. The confessor did not turn. He continued the catechism, cycling through the verses with the mechanical persistence of someone who has been speaking for a long time and has no expectation of stopping. The chapel was cold, noticeably colder than the corridor. I could feel the chill through my archival tunic, pressing against my chest like a hand. After perhaps 3 minutes, the confessor reached the end of the catechism and began again from the first verse. His voice did not strengthen. If anything, it diminished, each repetition slightly quieter than the last, as though the words were being absorbed by the bare walls and returning nothing. I shifted my weight. The deck plating creaked. The confessor turned. His face was older than his robe suggested, lined and dry, the skin around his eyes drawn tight in a way that made his gaze seem permanently narrowed. He looked at me without alarm, without anger, with the patient, empty attention of someone who has been interrupted before and expects to be interrupted again. "This chapel is reserved," he said. His voice was calm. "I apologize, confessor. I was verifying a purity seal and noticed the door was open." He nodded. "Necessary austerity," he said, as though the phrase were a designation, a technical term with a specific doctrinal meaning. "This space serves a particular purpose." I looked at the bare walls, the unadorned altar, the etched aquila, rough as a wound. What purpose? The question left my mouth before I could measure it. The confessor's expression did not change. "Subtraction," he said. He turned back to the altar and resumed the catechism. I stood for another moment, listening to his voice thin and tighten on the verse about silence, and then I stepped back into the corridor and closed the door behind me. I did not report the chapel. I returned to my station, filed the purity seal correction, and continued my shift. The decision not to report was not conscious in the way that a rebellion is conscious. It was more like the decision not to touch a hot surface, instinctive, immediate, and rooted in something deeper than thought. The chapel was not irregular, it was reserved. The confessor had used an authorized term. His presence there was sanctioned. But the ship, the holiest vessel in the Imperium, maintained a room devoted not to worship but to its opposite, a space where faith was not amplified but reduced, stripped, subtracted until only the raw structure remained. I chose not to report this because reporting it would require me to describe it, and describing it would require me to admit that I understood what it meant. Silence served unity better than accuracy. The observation blister access came as a reward, though I did not know what I had done to earn it. A notation appeared on my shift assignment 3 days after the chapel. Authorized for observation blister 7, Aurum, 1 hour access, shift 4, by order of the Administratum Liaison. The notation included a pass code and a route map. I had never been granted observation access before. It was a privilege typically reserved for senior officers, navigators, attendants, and certain mechanicus overseers who required visual confirmation of external fleet positioning. Observation Blister 7. Aurum was located on the flagship's dorsal surface, accessed through a spiraling stairway that climbed through 4 decks of progressively restricted access. Each level required a separate clearance scan. The stairway was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and the walls were bare metal, unbuffered by devotional paneling. The higher I climbed, the more the ship's sounds changed. The hymns and bells faded, the reactor hum deepened, and a new sound emerged, a low, constant vibration I had not heard before, rhythmic and grinding, like the respiration of something vast. The blister itself was a hemisphere of reinforced armor glass set into the hull's upper surface, protruding slightly above the ship's dorsal armor line. When I stepped through the access hatch and into the observation chamber, the viewport filled my entire field of vision. I had never seen the void from this perspective. I had never seen the fleet. The Emperor's flagship stretched below and behind me, a continent of metal and cathedral spire and weapon battery, its surface textured with gunport arrays, sensor masts, communications towers, and the armored domes of shield generators. At this scale, the ship did not resemble a cathedral, it resembled a command node, a control nexus bristling with instruments of authority. The golden aquila at the prow was visible as a distant gleam, but it was dwarfed by the macro cannon batteries that flanked it, their barrels long enough to serve as docking bays for smaller craft. The fleet spread around the flagship in formation. Cruisers, destroyers, frigates, troop transports, supply barges, all maintaining precise distances enforced by the flagship's navigational authority. Beyond them, the stars burned cold and indifferent. I stood in the blister for 20 minutes, pressing my hands against the armor glass, feeling the faint vibration of the ship's engines transmitted through the hull. The silence was near total. Sound does not carry in vacuum, and the blister's insulation reduced even the internal ship noise to a muffled whisper. Then I saw the civilian transport. It was small by fleet standards, a boxy hauler-class vessel with an oversized cargo section and a blunt, ungraceful prow. It was positioned at the edge of the formation, slightly out of alignment, and as I watched, I saw its running lights flicker in an irregular pattern that suggested a communication fault or drive instability. A fleet escort, a frigate bearing the markings of Battle Fleet Obscurus, altered its heading. The frigate's movement was smooth and purposeful, a predator's adjustment. It angled toward the civilian transport and held position approximately 400 meters off its port side. I did not hear the hail. I did not hear the demand for identification or compliance. These things happened on frequencies I had no access to, transmitted between bridge crews and fleet command in encrypted bursts. What I saw was the result. The frigate fired. A single lance strike, visible as a bar of brilliant white light that existed for less than a second before it connected with the civilian transport's midsection. The hull breached instantly. Atmosphere vented in a plume of crystallizing gas that caught the light of distant stars and scattered it into a brief, sparkling haze. The transport's forward section tumbled away from the aft section, both halves dark, both halves spinning slowly in the frictionless emptiness. Debris expanded outward. Some of it was structural, hull plating, support beams, conduit bundles. Some of it was smaller, irregular, and I chose not to identify it further. The frigate resumed formation. Its running lights were steady and bright. The whole event, from the first course adjustment to the final debris scatter, had taken less than 90 seconds. No hymn accompanied the act. No prayer was spoken. No confessor blessed the dead. I stood in the observation blister and watched the debris drift until it was too small to see, and then I watched the empty space where it had been, and then I looked at the flagship beneath me and saw it for what it was. Not a cathedral, not a sanctuary, not a monument to the Emperor's mercy, a command vessel, a weapon platform, an instrument of authority that radiated not holiness but compliance. The frigate had fired because the civilian transport had failed to respond to hails quickly enough. I knew this because I had processed fleet action reports as part of my archival cross-training. Standard engagement protocol for non-responsive vessels within fleet formation during active crusade operations. 1 hail, 1 warning, 1 shot. 3 steps, each documented, each correct. The observation pass expired at the end of the hour. I descended the stairway, passed through the clearance checkpoints, and returned to the habitation deck. The hymns resumed around me, the bells chimed, the incense returned. I went to evening devotions and spoke the catechism and knelt before the Emperor's image and said the words I had been saying for 11 months. In the Emperor's sight we stand. My voice did not tremble, but the words felt different now, not false, not hollow, different, the way a tool feels different once you understand what it was designed to cut. The audit began without announcement. 1 shift, The assignment queue contained standard archival tasks. The next, it contained a directive marked with the seal of the Administratum Comptroller's office, a division I had never interacted with, and whose existence I had only known from the organizational chart posted in the senior archivist's anteroom. The directive informed all archival scribes in Vault Sector Aurum that a comprehensive audit of devotional output metrics was underway. All logs, inventories, ceremonial records, purity seal registries, and witness attestations for the preceding 6 months were to be compiled and submitted within 48 hours. The language was administrative. The tone was neutral. The implication was absolute. Everything I had recorded was now under review. I compiled my records. The process took 11 hours. I pulled every log, every stamp verification, every ceremonial notation, every amended form. I arranged them in chronological order, cross-referenced by vault sector and relic designation, and bound them in the standard archival folio with a wax seal bearing my scribe witness mark. The folio was collected by a courier and taken to Deck Primus. I resumed normal duties and waited. 3 days later, I was summoned. The auditors occupied a chamber on Deck Secundus that I had not known existed. The room was long and windowless, lit by overhead lumens that cast a flat, shadowless light across a row of identical workstations, each equipped with a data lectern, a parchment rack, and a magnification lens mounted on an articulated arm. 6 auditors were present, 3 human and 3 servitor augmented, their biological components reduced to the minimum necessary for cognitive function while their mechanical additions handled data processing, cross-referencing, and archival retrieval at speeds I could not match. The human auditors wore grey robes without insignia. Their faces were unremarkable. They did not introduce themselves. One of them, a woman with close-cropped hair and a data monocle clamped over her left eye, waved me to a chair opposite her workstation and began. The questions were specific. How many purity seals had I applied in the month of Secundus? What was the standard incense measurement for the sealing of a minor reliquary versus a major reliquary? Had I personally witnessed the interior of any vault during a sealing ceremony? If so, which vaults? What had I observed? I answered each question with the precision of someone who understands that imprecision is more dangerous than admission. I provided exact numbers. I cited protocol references. I described my duties with the flat, procedural language of a well-trained scribe. When the auditor asked about the 9th reliquary, her data monocle clicked as its lens adjusted focus. She did not ask what I had seen. She asked what I had recorded. Reliquary 9, spiritually complete, I said. She checked her data lectern. The notation matched. She made a mark on her assessment sheet and moved to the next question. The audit continued for 2 hours. At no point was I accused of anything. At no point was my loyalty questioned. The process was calibrated to identify deviation, not motive. The auditors were not interested in what I thought or felt. They were interested in whether the numbers aligned. In the final quarter hour, the auditor informed me that my role was being restructured. Effective immediately, my designation was changing from Scribe Witness Tertius to Devotional Output Assessor, Tier 2. My responsibilities would shift from cataloging relics and stamping purity seals to evaluating devotional efficiency across assigned ship sectors. I would assess shrine usage rates, liturgical attendance metrics, and the morale impact of devotional architecture, and I would submit recommendations for optimization. The word she used was optimization. She said it the way one says filing, without emphasis, without weight. I was given a new assignment folio, a revised clearance badge, and a data slate loaded with assessment templates. The auditor informed me that my prior archival authority, including access to the reliquary vaults, had been rescinded as a procedural consequence of role reassignment. I left the chamber carrying my new designation and my new tools and my rescinded authority. and I understood that the reassignment was not punishment, it was not reward, it was containment. I had witnessed something that existed outside the approved record, and rather than correct me, the system had repositioned me until what I had witnessed no longer fell within my jurisdiction. The summons to the Chamber of Record Correction arrived on my data slate 2 days after the audit, formatted as a standard interdepartmental notice with the subject line, Archival Reconciliation Request. Reference: 9th Reliquary, Sector Aurum, 9. I followed the route map to Deck Primus, Section 12. The corridor leading to the chamber was wider than standard, its walls lined with stained glass panels that depicted the Emperor enthroned on Terra, light radiating from his form in geometric patterns that suggested order rather than warmth. The glass was thick, triple-layered, and the lumen strips behind it were calibrated to shift intensity every 20 seconds, creating a slow pulse that made the Emperor's image appear to breathe. The chamber itself was circular, approximately 15 meters in diameter, with a domed ceiling painted the deep blue of void space and scattered with pinprick lumens arranged in the pattern of constellations visible from Holy Terra. A single desk occupied the center, curved to follow the room's shape, and behind it sat 2 figures. A confessor I did not recognize, wearing full vestments with the added insignia of the Ordo Redactus, and a servitor whose upper body had been replaced almost entirely with data processing hardware. The servitor's remaining biological component was its left hand, still flesh, still functional, and it held a quill. Servo skulls circled the room in a slow orbit, 6 of them. Their eye sockets glowed with a pale green light that cast no shadows. The confessor spoke first. His voice was measured and practiced, each word selected with the precision of someone who has been trained to use language as a surgical instrument. Scribe Witness Tertius, you are recognized. I noted that he used my former designation. The reassignment had not yet been updated in all systems. Your attendance at the sealing of the 9th Reliquary, Vault Sector Aurum, 9, has been noted in the ceremonial log. Your witness attestation states, spiritually complete. The official record concurs. However, a supplementary review has identified potential archival inconsistencies between the ceremonial log and internal monitoring data captured during the ceremony. These inconsistencies require reconciliation. I said nothing. The confessor had not asked a question. He continued. The interior condition of the 9th Reliquary is designated spiritually inaccessible. This designation supersedes all prior descriptors, including but not limited to spiritually complete, vacant, pending, or under-consecrated. The term spiritually inaccessible reflects the doctrinal reality that the vault's contents exist in a state of sacred indeterminacy and are not subject to mortal observation or interpretation. I recognized the language. It was the same type of doctrinal precision I had encountered in the amendment directives for the Pilgrim intake records. Each word defensible, each word examined individually, carrying weight. Together, they formed a structure that was not deceptive, but was impenetrable. The vault was not empty. It was spiritually inaccessible. My eyes had not been wrong. They had been insufficient. The confessor placed a document on the desk. It was a single page, printed on heavy parchment, bearing the seals of the Administratum, the Ministorum, and the Ordo Redactus. The text was brief, a statement of consent for hypno-doctrinal recalibration, described as corrective alignment of witnessed perception to reconcile with doctrinal record. This is not punitive, the confessor said. This is refinement. Your loyalty is not in question. Your compliance record is exemplary. The recalibration will resolve the inconsistency between experiential memory and archival truth, ensuring that your continued service remains unclouded by perceptual variance. The servitor's flesh hand placed the quill beside the document. The inkwell was already open. The ink was black, without the violet tint of archival ink. Standard bureaucratic issue. I looked at the consent form. I looked at the confessor. I looked at the servo skulls, still orbiting, their green eyes steady and unblinking. No threat had been spoken. No punishment had been implied. The process was offered as maintenance, the same way a Mechanicus adept might offer to adjust a data lectern that displayed a slight calibration error. The lectern was not broken, it simply needed alignment. I picked up the quill. The nib was sharp and freshly cut. I signed my name at the bottom of the consent form, beneath the line that read, "Subject acknowledges voluntary participation in the reconciliation process and affirms doctrinal obedience to the Imperium of Man." My handwriting was steady. The letters were clear. The confessor collected the document, verified my signature against the one in my personnel file, and nodded. The servitor made a notation on a data slate embedded in its chest housing. The servo skulls adjusted their orbit, tightening slightly, drawing closer. The process began immediately. I was guided to a reclined chair positioned against the wall, its surface padded with a material that conformed to my body as I settled into it. Restraints were not applied. The chair's headrest contained embedded audio emitters, and as I laid my head back, the confessor began the litany of perceptual alignment, a catechism I had never heard before, its cadence slower and more repetitive than standard devotional rites. The words were in low Gothic, but the sentence structures were unusual, recursive, looping back on themselves in patterns that made it difficult to track where one verse ended and another began. The servo skulls descended. Two of them positioned themselves on either side of my head, their lumen eyes shifting from green to a deep amber. A low-frequency tone began emanating from their housings. Not loud, but pervasive, filling the space behind my eyes with a vibration that made thought feel sluggish. I do not know how long the session lasted. The confessor's voice continued throughout, steady and unchanging, and the amber light filled my peripheral vision until the chamber's ceiling, the dome of painted stars, seemed to recede, pulling away, as though I was sinking into the chair or the chair was sinking into the floor. The vault, I saw it. The ninth reliquary, the bare walls, the deck plating, the relic crate sitting alone in a space designed to hold nothing. But as the confessor's voice cycled through the litany, the image softened, the edges blurred. The stark clarity of empty metal and undressed ceramite wavered like heat haze above a plasma conduit, and in its place came a sensation of depth, not fullness. Not the presence of shrines or icons, just depth. The sense that the emptiness extended further than my eyes could measure, that what I had seen was not the chamber's entirety but a surface, and beneath it lay something I was not equipped to perceive, spiritually inaccessible. The words settled into the image like sediment into water, clouding the clarity without erasing it entirely. I could still see the bare walls if I focused. But the act of focusing required effort now, and the effort felt unnecessary, like straining to read text in a language I did not speak. The session ended with a chime, a single note, clear and bright, emitted by the servo skull nearest my right ear. The amber light faded. The confessor concluded the litany and stepped back. I sat up. The chamber was the same. The stained glass still pulsed. The stars still dotted the ceiling. The confessor's expression was the same patient, professional regard it had held throughout. "The reconciliation is complete," he said. "Your records have been updated. Your compliance is noted and appreciated." I stood. My legs were steady. My thoughts were clear, or rather, they felt clear, the way a room feels clean after someone has removed a piece of furniture. The space was the same. The proportions were the same. But something was gone, and the absence had been smoothed over so efficiently that I had to work to remember what had occupied the space before. The vault, the ninth reliquary. I could still recall being there. I could still recall the sealing ceremony, but the interior, the empty chamber, had become uncertain, not erased. Uncertain. Like a dream examined in daylight, its details plausible but untrustworthy. I returned to my station. I opened my new assignment folio and began the day's assessments. The work was different from archival cataloging but structurally similar. Data in, evaluation applied, recommendation out. I assessed shrine usage rates for 3 sectors, cross-referencing attendance logs against labor productivity metrics. On my data slate, the 9th reliquary was listed as spiritually inaccessible. I read the entry without reaction. It seemed correct. It had always been correct. Somewhere beneath the certainty, a splinter remained. Not sharp, not painful, just present. The faintest sensation that something had been removed and its removal had been approved and my approval had been part of the process. I worked through the shift. The bells chimed. The hymns played. I spoke the catechism at evening devotions without tremor, without pause, without searching the confessor's face for anything that should not be there. The following weeks were defined by assessment templates and efficiency ratios. My new role carried me through sections of the ship I had never visited and never would have visited as an archivist. I walked devotional corridors with a data slate in hand, counting candle niches, measuring altar dimensions, timing liturgical services with a chronopiece calibrated to the second. I sat in chapels during services and recorded the number of attendees, the average duration of prayer, the frequency with which certain catechisms were repeated versus skipped. The data I collected was compiled into reports that were transmitted to the Administratum Comptroller's office on Deck Primus. The reports generated recommendations. The recommendations generated action orders, and the action orders, when implemented, reduced. A chapel serving 37 attendees was consolidated with an adjacent chapel serving 42. The combined congregation shared one space, one confessor, and one set of devotional furnishings. The vacated chapel was repurposed as a storage annex for maintenance supplies. A shrine alcove positioned at a corridor junction was removed after my assessment indicated it impeded traffic flow during shift changes, resulting in a measurable decrease in transit efficiency. The alcove was sealed with a plain metal panel, and the icon that had occupied it, a small rendering of the Emperor's hand raised in benediction, was transferred to the redundant devotional structure inventory in the lower cargo arteries. A liturgical service that had traditionally run 45 minutes was shortened to 30 after my productivity analysis demonstrated that the additional 15 minutes correlated with a 4% decrease in subsequent shift. Output among attendees. I recommended each of these reductions. I signed each recommendation. I did not hesitate. The process was clear to me now. The Emperor's ship did not exist to inspire. It existed to function. Every devotional element aboard was subject to the same operational calculus that governed munitions allocation, atmospheric processing, and hull maintenance. Faith was a resource. Like any resource, it had to be managed. Surplus was waste. Excess was inefficiency. The ship's holiness lay not in the abundance of its worship, but in the precision with which worship was calibrated to serve the Imperium's needs. I realized this not as revelation but as alignment. The pieces I had observed, the empty vault, the stored chapel modules, the redistributed pilgrims, the stripped chapel, the destroyed transport, assembled themselves into a coherent structure. Nothing I had seen was aberrant. Nothing I had experienced was malfunction. The system was working. I was watching it work. 2 months into my new role, I was granted access to the historical archive for comparative analysis. The Administratum Comptroller's office required longitudinal data on devotional output trends to calibrate future optimization schedules. I was directed to review logs spanning the prior 3 centuries of the flagship's operational history. The archive was located deep in the ship's midsection. housed in a climate-controlled vault whose air was dry and thin and smelled of parchment, preservative, and static. The logs were stored on data crystal racks, each crystal containing compressed records from a specific decade, and the retrieval system required a combination of mechanical indexing and servo-skull-assisted navigation. I began with the most recent century and worked backward. The patterns were identical. Shrine reduction orders appeared at regular intervals, typically following major campaign phases. Pilgrim redistribution directives, worded in the same precise language I had been instructed to use, recurred with each new intake wave. Chapel consolidation recommendations, formatted on templates indistinguishable from the ones I used, appeared in records dating back over 200 years. And the reliquary designations. I searched for spiritually inaccessible. The phrase appeared 147 times across 3 centuries. It had been applied to vaults in every sector of the ship, always following a sealing ceremony, always accompanied by a witness attestation affirming spiritual completeness. I found the logs of prior archivists. Their names were different, their handwriting was different, their phrasing varied, but the trajectory was the same. They catalogued, they witnessed, they were reassigned, their records were amended. Some consented to recalibration, some were simply transferred to other duties without notation. One log, dated approximately 180 years before my assignment, contained a marginal annotation in handwriting so small I needed the magnification lens to read it. The annotation read, "The reliquary was empty, as before, as always." The ink was faded. The parchment was brittle. The notation had not been redacted because no one had ever looked closely enough to find it. I read it 3 times. I replaced the data crystal in its rack. I completed my comparative analysis and submitted the report. In the section on longitudinal devotional trends, I noted a consistent pattern of optimization and recommended its continuation. I did not mention the marginal annotation, I did not copy it, I did not record its location. It changed nothing. It only confirmed what I already understood. The cycle was older than me, older than my predecessors, older than the current crusade. The ship had been filtering faith since before anyone currently aboard had been born. This was not corruption. Corruption implies deviation from intended function. The ship was functioning exactly as intended. The reliquaries were not supposed to be full, they were supposed to be designated. The designation was the function. The seal on the door was not protecting a relic, it was protecting the record. I walked back through the arterial corridors to my station. The stained glass threw colored light across the deck plating. Hymns played through the Vox speakers. A procession of shipborne children, led by a junior confessor, walked in double file toward a catechism lesson, their small voices reciting the opening verse of the Emperor's devotion in unison. They passed me without looking up. Their words were perfect, their posture was correct, their faith was being formed. I watched them go. The smallest child, a girl no older than 6, stumbled slightly on a seam in the deck plating. The child behind her steadied her with a hand on the shoulder, and they continued without breaking cadence. The hymn changed. The bells chimed. The ship moved through the void. Time aboard the flagship was not measured in days or weeks, but in shift cycles and devotional periods. The bells marked every transition. The beginning of work, the end of work, the call to prayer, the call to sleep. Between the bells, the work filled the hours completely. There were no gaps. There were no intervals of unstructured time in which a person might sit and think without purpose. The schedule was designed to prevent exactly that. My evaluations continued. I was thorough. My reports were concise, well-sourced, and consistent with the Administratum's optimization framework. I received commendations in the form of notation marks on my personnel file, small symbols that indicated satisfactory performance. No praise was spoken, no recognition ceremony was held. The notations simply appeared, and my clearance level adjusted upward by a single tier, granting access to additional assessment sectors. I used the expanded access to evaluate the flagship's secondary devotional tier, a ring of chapels and shrines that served the labor decks and engineering sections in the ship's lower midsection. These were less ornate than the upper-tier devotional spaces, but more heavily used. Shift workers attended brief devotional periods between rotations, kneeling in narrow chapels barely large enough for 20 people. Their coveralls stained with machine oil and hull sealant, their faces slack with fatigue. The chapels served a function I could now identify with precision. They provided a structured interval between labor shifts during which workers' attention was redirected from physical discomfort to spiritual compliance. The catechisms spoken in these chapels were shorter than standard. The liturgical content was simplified, focused on obedience, endurance, and the sanctity of service. The confessors who administered these services spoke with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned to deliver faith in compressed doses. I timed the services. I counted the attendees. I measured the interval between the end of devotions and the beginning of the next labor shift. I compared the data against productivity metrics for each section. My recommendation was that 2 of the 9 secondary chapels could be consolidated without measurable impact on labor morale. The space freed would accommodate a secondary atmospheric processing substation, reducing oxygen cycling time for the engineering sections by an estimated 3%. The recommendation was approved within 6 hours of submission. I received another notation. I did not feel pride. I did not feel regret. I felt the particular satisfaction of a mechanism performing its designed function. Input, evaluation, output. The process was clean. I began noticing my own speech patterns changing. In casual interactions with other archival staff, rare as they were, I found myself using the language of assessment rather than devotion. I referred to chapels as morale infrastructure. I described confessors as doctrinal delivery assets. I spoke of pilgrims as faith-bearing intake populations. The terminology was precise and institutional, drawn from the assessment templates I used daily, and it replaced the devotional vocabulary I had once used without effort. No one corrected me. The other assessors on my tier spoke the same way. We were not cynical. We were calibrated. One evening, after a shift that had lasted 14 hours due to a backlog in assessment requests, I returned to my berth and sat on the edge of my cot. The space was narrow, 2 meters by 3, with a fold-down writing shelf, a storage alcove, and a small devotional niche set into the wall above the head of the cot. The niche contained a printed icon of the Emperor, standard issue, mass-produced on the ship's own printing presses and distributed to every berth in the habitation tier. The icon showed the Emperor's face in profile, rendered in flat black ink on cream-colored cardstock, surrounded by a halo of geometric rays. I looked at the icon. I had looked at it every night for over a year. It was the first thing I saw upon waking and the last thing I saw before sleep, and it had served as the anchor of my personal devotion since the day I had moved into this berth. I had spoken the evening catechism to it. I had pressed my fingers to it before sleep. I had treated it as a conduit to the Emperor's attention. Now I looked at it and calculated its production cost. Cardstock, standard grade, 0.02 throne gelt per unit. Printing, single color, 0.005 throne gelt per impression. Distribution labor, amortized across the habitation tier, negligible. Total cost, approximately 0.025 throne gelt. The icon's assessed morale contribution, based on the Administratum's standard devotional impact metrics, was rated at 1.2 units on the Serenity Index, sufficient to justify continued production. I folded the icon's card stock edge back into the niche and lay down. The cot was firm, as all cots aboard the flagship were firm. Their mattresses compressed to specifications that balanced comfort against material cost. The pillow was a folded regulation blanket. The temperature in the berth was 18 degrees Celsius, maintained by the atmospheric processing system, neither warm nor cold, simply sufficient. I closed my eyes and did not pray. I did not decide not to pray. The impulse simply did not arise. The space where prayer had lived, the small, warm certainty that someone listened, had been replaced by assessment data and efficiency ratios, and the knowledge that devotion was a managed resource. The emperor was served by obedience, not by whispered words in a dark berth. Compliance was more valuable than contemplation. My work was my devotion. The system confirmed this. Sleep came quickly. It always did aboard the flagship. The atmospheric processors maintained oxygen levels that promoted rapid sleep onset. The environmental systems were efficient. Everything aboard was efficient. The correction came not in a single moment, but in a series of administrative actions that reclassified my identity as thoroughly as the 9th reliquary had been reclassified. First, my personnel file was updated to reflect my new designation, Devotional Output Assessor, Tier 2. My prior designation, Scribe Witness Tertius, was not deleted but was marked as superseded, a term that in administratum usage meant it no longer existed for any operational purpose. My authorization stamps for the reliquary vaults were deactivated. My access routes through Vault Sector Aurum were restricted to transit corridors only. If I walked past the 9th reliquary door, the corridor sensors would log my passage, but the door would not respond to my clearance badge. Second, my physical workspace was relocated. I was moved from the archival station in Vault Sector Aurum 9 to an assessment office on Deck Tertius, a functional room shared with 3 other assessors, equipped with data lecterns, filing systems, and a wall-mounted chrono that counted shift time remaining in descending red numerals. The room had no devotional niche, no icon, no incense. The air smelled of recycled atmosphere and data slate ozone. Third, my daily schedule was restructured. The extended morning devotions I had attended as an archivist were replaced with a brief, standardized compliance prayer recited at the start of each shift, lasting exactly 90 seconds. The prayer was pre-recorded, played through a speaker mounted above the office door, and spoken by a voice I did not recognize in a cadence optimized for clarity and brevity. There was no confessor present. There was no altar. We stood at our workstations, data slates in hand, and mouthed the words while the recording played. The system had not punished me. It had repositioned me. Every adjustment was procedural, documented, and justified by operational logic that I could not dispute because I understood it. I had been a witness. Now I was an instrument. Witnesses observe, instruments measure. The distinction was administrative, but it defined everything. My body adapted to the new schedule with the grudging compliance of any biological mechanism forced to operate under revised parameters. The shifts were longer. The work was repetitive in a different way, not the rhythmic satisfaction of stamping purity seals and transcribing names, but the gray, accumulating fatigue of evaluating numbers that determined whether a chapel lived or died. I assessed morale impact scores for devotional murals and recommended the removal of 3 that occupied wall space suitable for Vox relay installation. I reviewed prayer attendance logs and identified statistical anomalies that indicated certain confessors were retaining congregants beyond the approved liturgical duration, and I flagged these anomalies for correction. Each recommendation was a subtraction. I subtracted a shrine. I subtracted a mural. I subtracted 15 minutes from a liturgical schedule. I subtracted candles from a corridor. I subtracted a singing servitor from a refectory. I subtracted a prayer bell from a labor deck junction. The flagship's devotional architecture contracted around me, or rather, I was part of the mechanism that contracted it. One assessor among many, each applying the same calculus to their assigned sectors, each filing recommendations that were approved and implemented with the quiet efficiency of a body metabolizing nutrients. What was needed was kept, what was excess was removed. The process was not destructive, it was digestive. The pilgrims continued to arrive. Each crusade victory generated refugees, survivors, faithful remnants of worlds that had been saved or purged or reclaimed. They were processed through the intake hall with the same incense and the same servo-cherubs and the same blessing of arrival. They knelt on the marble floor and wept. Their names were entered into the ledger, and then the names were amended, relocated for spiritual integration. The phrase had become so familiar to me that I could write it from muscle memory. The way a soldier assembles a weapon, each letter falling into place without conscious direction. I no longer processed pilgrim intake directly, that task belonged to the archival staff, but I reviewed the intake metrics as part of my assessment work, and the numbers were consistent. Between 60 and 80% of all pilgrims received aboard the flagship were reassigned to labor functions within their first shift cycle. The remaining 20 to 40% were distributed across residential tiers and granted pilgrim status for periods ranging from 2 weeks to 6 months, after which they were reassessed and, in most cases, reclassified as auxiliary crew. The pilgrim roles shrank. The labor allocation registry grew. The ship's population remained stable because the system regulated inflow and outflow with the same precision it regulated atmospheric composition. I understood the logic. I endorsed the logic. Labor was necessary. The flagship required maintenance crews, waste processors, atmospheric technicians, cargo handlers, munitions loaders, and 1,000 other roles that consumed human effort the way the reactors consumed fuel. Pilgrims who arrived expecting salvation received something more valuable: purpose. Their faith was not extinguished, it was redirected. They served the Emperor through labor rather than prayer, and labor was more measurable, more controllable, more useful. I believed this. The belief did not feel like belief. It felt like arithmetic. The shifts blurred. 50-day cycles passed with the regularity of tidal patterns, each cycle identical in structure, differing only in the specific sectors I assessed and the specific reductions I recommended. I ate grain paste and protein in the refectory and no longer looked at the ceiling mosaic. I slept on my cot beneath the mass-produced icon and no longer spoke to it. I attended the 90-second compliance prayer and mouthed the words and felt nothing except the mild satisfaction of having checked a box. The splinter remained, the one the hypno-recalibration had dulled but not removed. It sat in the back of my awareness like a hairline fracture in a load-bearing wall, invisible under normal conditions, detectable only when pressure was applied from a specific angle. The 9th reliquary, the empty vault, the chamber that was now designated spiritually inaccessible. I did not think about it deliberately. I did not revisit the memory or probe it for clarity, but it was there. When I signed a recommendation to consolidate a chapel, it was there. When I recorded the removal of a devotional icon from a corridor wall, it was there. When I amended a pilgrim's designation from faithful to auxiliary crew, class Septimus, it was there. It did not whisper. It did not accuse. It simply existed. A fact that the system had attempted to reconcile and had mostly succeeded in softening into irrelevance. Mostly, I worked. The ship moved through the void. Systems within systems within systems, each regulating the others, each contributing to the vessel's continued function with the interlocking precision of a chrono's internal mechanism. The bells chimed. The hymns played. The Emperor's face gazed from 1,000 icons, each printed at 0.025 throne gelt, each contributing 1.2 units on the Serenity Index, each replaceable, each replaced. I submitted my quarterly assessment summary. The summary contained 47 recommendations for devotional optimization across 4 ship sectors. 39 of the recommendations involved reduction or consolidation. 8 involved reallocation of devotional resources to higher traffic areas where morale impact per unit of investment was greater. Net result: a 12% decrease in devotional footprint with a projected 2% increase in morale efficiency. The summary was approved. I received a notation. I was efficient. I was correct. I was performing exactly the function the system required. On the 419th day of my service aboard the Emperor's flagship, I was walking through a transit corridor on deck quarters when the lights dimmed for 17 seconds. A power fluctuation, common enough aboard any vessel of this size, caused by the momentary redistribution of energy during a weapons test or shield calibration. The lumen strips flickered, steadied, and returned to full brightness. In the 17 seconds of dimness, I stopped walking. The corridor was empty. The transit traffic had thinned between shift changes, and I stood alone in a passage lined with stained glass panels that, without lumen backlighting, were just dark-colored shapes against the wall. The hymn that had been playing through the Vox speakers cut out during the fluctuation and was replaced by a faint static hiss that filled the corridor like the memory of sound. I stood still. The ship's structural groans were audible without the overlay of devotional noise, the deep metallic voice of a hull holding vacuum at bay, plasma reactors cycling, void shields pulsing. The sound was not sacred. It was mechanical. It was the sound of survival, bare and functional. The lights returned. The hymn resumed. I continued walking. But in those 17 seconds, I had felt the ship without its devotional covering. And what I had felt was not emptiness. It was efficiency. The ship ran on plasma and obedience, and the calculated distribution of faith in measured quantities, and every ornament, every hymn, every icon, every catechism was a layer applied over that core function, not to disguise it, but to make it tolerable. The Emperor's ship was holy. This I still believed, or rather, this I still accepted, because belief and acceptance had become the same thing under the pressure of the system's constant affirmation. But its holiness was not what I had been taught. Its holiness did not lie in the abundance of its shrines, or the fervor of its worship, or the purity of its crew. Its holiness lay in subtraction, in the removal of every element that did not serve the Imperium's continuation, in the stripping of faith to its operational minimum, in the transformation of devotion from an expression of love into an instrument of control. The ship was holy because it had been refined, reduced, optimized, until only what was necessary remained. The 9th reliquary was empty because a full reliquary was a relic collection. An empty reliquary sealed and designated was a demonstration of authority. The seal on the door did not protect what was inside. It enforced the record of what was supposed to be inside. The distinction mattered. It was the distinction between a shrine and a statement. I arrived at my assessment office. I sat at my workstation. I opened the day's queue. 11 sectors awaiting evaluation. 14 chapels scheduled for consolidation review. 3 confessors flagged for liturgical duration variance. I began working. The assessment template loaded on my data slate. I filled in the first field, sector designation. The second field, devotional asset count. The third field, recommended action. I wrote, reduce in the third field. I did not need to visit the sector to know this was the correct recommendation. It was always the correct recommendation. The system existed to reduce. I existed to recommend reduction. The process was not circular. It was progressive. Each reduction created the conditions for the next. I completed the first assessment in 12 minutes. I moved to the second, then the third. The chrono on the wall counted down the shift in red numerals. The compliance prayer played. I mouthed the words. Outside the observation blisters I would never visit again, the fleet moved in formation, obedient and precise. Worlds burned or were saved according to the strategic calculus of command authorities, whose names I did not know and whose decisions I would never question. The Emperor sat on his throne on distant Terra, sustaining the Astronomicon, holding the Imperium together through an act of will or agony or both, and the flagship that bore his name carried his authority through the void like a blade carries the intent of the hand that holds it. I measured silence. This was my function. I quantified the space where devotion had been removed and confirmed that its absence was correct. I catalogued the voids. I assessed the emptiness. I stamped my approval on the subtraction of every unnecessary prayer, every excessive candle, every shrine that consumed space a relay conduit could better use. The ship was immaculate. I had helped make it so. Every surface was accounted for, every soul was allocated, every hour was scheduled, every bell timed, every hymn calibrated to the second. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was excessive. Nothing existed aboard this vessel without serving the Imperium's continuity. I understood this. I endorsed this. I continued this. The bells chimed. The shift ended. The next began. I opened my data slate. I filled in the first field. The flagship moved through the void, radiant and inviolable, its hull reflecting the light of stars it would never acknowledge, its corridors echoing with hymns whose duration I had helped to shorten, its chapels smaller than they had been when I arrived, its shrines fewer, its icons precisely counted and precisely justified, and precisely sufficient. I did not pray. I did not need to. My work was prayer. My compliance was devotion. My silence was faith. The ship was holy, not because of what it contained, because of what it had removed. And what it had removed